All right, I'm recording.
All right, let's do it.
Turn your recording. All right, cool.
Recording.
I will do a little introduction in the beginning, like personally introducing you. So we could just jump right into it. In terms of how we've been starting is talking about COVID, but I guess for you, being a trainer in the soccer space, how did you start with that? How did you balance that with your playing career, and how did you sort of pivot towards training? How do you want to begin?
Yeah, so I played Division III soccer, so not at a crazy high level. And I was always like a decent athlete, like a much better athlete than soccer player probably. So I always enjoyed the training side of things, the weightlifting, the conditioning, just because those are things that I personally excelled at. Um, but being at a D3 school, like we didn't have strength and conditioning coaches. We had a weight room that the football team used, but none of the other athletes really used it. So I knew like professional strength coaches existed. Like I knew that was a thing, but I had no idea how to get involved with it. So once I finished my undergrad, I took a graduate assistantship at the University of Utah. Still had no connections in like the strength and conditioning industry. So my GA position was in the physiology lab, which in hindsight ended up being really good experience. I did like bod pods, VO2 maxes, blood lactates, like nutrition counseling, exercise counseling, or like personal training essentially. So I had like 20 hours a week in there. And then one of the guys that was in my my program, his GA was in the weight room. He worked with women's soccer. So I was like, cool, this is what I want to do. Like, I want to do what you do. And he's like, just start coming in and helping me out with the women's soccer team. And then it kind of grew from there. So I ended up, by the end, I was doing like another 20, 30 hours a week in the weight room. And then kind of how I got into soccer is, especially maybe 10 years ago, strength conditioning, I would say it's evolved a little bit, but it was predominantly most college strength coaches were former like football, basketball, baseball players, like the teams that tended to do a lot of lifting. So kind of my niche early on was like, I was someone who liked soccer. Like I was abnormally excited to work with the women's soccer team at University of Utah. And then you can kind of like speak the language with the coaches. You can kind of design more soccer specific drills and things like that, which I think kind of helps with buy-in from the coaches and from the players. So that's kind of how I got my start at the University of Utah. And then just a kind of journey first. So then after that, so after I got my master's, my first job was a paid intern at University of Georgia, which was unbelievable because they had unbelievable facilities and a ton of really, really good teams. So I worked with like the swimming team. They won the national championship. Women's tennis, they were number one in the nation all year. Equestrian, we won the national championship. Cheerleading, just worked with a lot of teams that were really good for college sports. So I was there for a year. Then my first full-time real job was in Northern Arizona University. It's like a smaller Division I school. And then I worked men's and women's basketball and women's soccer out there. From there, I got the job at University of Maryland doing first of all, just men's soccer, golf, and gymnastics. And then after the first year there, I hopped on with lacrosse. I don't even really remember how it happened. I think I just met Tillman and he liked me. And then they're like, do you want to do lacrosse? I know what it was. You guys got GPS. And I was kind of like the only one on staff at the time that had experience with it. So I was like, I'll do your GPS stuff, and then kind of just transitioned to being the strength coach. That was the first time I'd ever worked with lacrosse. And I'm not exaggerating. I was telling someone about this the other day because there was lacrosse on ESPN, like the most fun sport to work with. Like I still like soccer a ton, and like that's what I'm more experienced with. But lacrosse was so much fun in terms of like the sport, and then like the guys are a little bit meatheads, like a little bit like football. So like the lifting piece is a lot bigger in lacrosse than it is with soccer. So like the weight room stuff is a little bit more fun. Yeah, it was awesome. It was crazy on TV the other day. It was you guys playing against Denver. So whatever year that was.
2015.
Yeah. And all you guys were on the field.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then I was at Maryland for 2 years. Then my first professional job, I did soccer at New York Red Bull, which was very different experience just because it was a very European, South American kind of foreign-based players, so their kind of attitude towards strength conditioning is much different. But I got a lot better on the field. The coaching staff was unbelievable. So I was there for a year, and then I thought I wanted to go back to college. I went back to University of Michigan with Kevin Connery. And then I'd kind of forgotten how much I disliked college in terms of like all the rules, like the kids I love having to go to class. We're once you're in the professional environment, there's no restrictions. Like we train whenever we want. We do whatever we want in training. The players, obviously, this is like their livelihood. So they're a little bit more committed in terms of like off-field stuff, like in like recovery between sessions, things like that. And you just have all day. It's like, when do you want to train? It doesn't matter. We'll train whenever. Like these guys get paid to be here. We'll tell them to show up whenever. There's a lot less external pressure. Where like in college, you have class, you have social life, like guys are going out, things like that. And you just have that much less in the professional environment. So I kind of missed that. So then I got the job out at Real Salt Lake, and I've been here for 2.5 years.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's kind of the brief journey over the last 10 years of my life.
Before we dive into that, so you say that working with Maryland men's lacrosse was your favorite year of training people?
It was up there. So because you guys and soccer, I mean, I love my job now, but you do miss a little bit with soccer in the weight room, just because it's just not the same. You're not doing as much in the weight room. Like getting big and strong isn't as important in soccer. Like obviously there are some players that need to increase their size and strength, but for the most part, it's like, okay, we're trying to increase guys' strength as much as possible while trying to put on as little body mass as possible, because they need to run around for 90 minutes, cover 12,000 meters. There isn't a huge need for like body armor building, especially upper body. Like but obviously there is in lacrosse. So lacrosse, we did a lot more in the weight room, and guys were just really enthusiastic about it. I just remember it was a lot of fun. Like, wasn't there like no shirt Fridays or something in the weight room? I feel like I vaguely remember. I don't know if it was an official thing, but it was something that happened a lot.
Yeah. Tarps did pop off every Friday.
Yeah, it popped up a lot.
Yeah. I love that.
And we just had a good setup. We had the varsity team house. Like, it definitely wasn't the most glamorous weight room in the world, but I liked it because it was just me over there. There was usually one other person in there, but like that was our weight room. We had the 10 racks. We had the turf field right out back. Like you had everything you needed. It was nice.
Yeah, it was good stuff.
Gritty over there.
Yeah, gritty. We didn't have like a nice new weight room, but like the equipment was fine. Like it was good enough.
Okay.
So when you first started getting into the strength training and realized you were passionate about it, you said you didn't really have like a strength coach at your college. Were you just always like passionate about it and just kind of held yourself accountable and would just educate yourself on what you should be doing? But it's like, I just lost my train of thought kind of, but when you started to get into it, was it more just like mimicking the other coaches that you were working with and learning from them? Or had you already kind of started to educate yourself? Like, what was the process like for you to start, like, actually figure out what you were doing?
Yeah, it was a lot of just like me coming up with stuff on my own. Because growing up, so in high school, there was like a strength class you could take. So I took the strength and conditioning class, but like most high schools, it's run by the football strength coach. But at the time, like that stuff is fine. Like when you're in high school and you've never done any strength training, you're so weak that like doing anything helps. So you could do the worst program in the world, but like you've never done anything before. So you're going to get bigger, faster, stronger. So like the younger and the less experienced population you work with, like really the easier it is to work with those populations. So I had that a little bit of experience coming out of high school. And then kind of like I said in college, like I definitely wasn't the most skilled player in the world. I was always just like a pretty good athlete. So I felt like I just kind of leaned into that. Like, okay, if this is going to be my thing, like being really fit, being really fast, being physical, like I'm going to really maximize my strengths. So it was just me deciding on my own, like that's what I wanted to do. And I always enjoyed it. Like I enjoy strength training. I enjoy working out. I enjoy running, things like that. So there's like a certification that most strength coaches have called the Certified Strength and Conditioning Specialist from the NCAA. It's kind of the main one. And I just found out, like I said, when I was in college, I was like, oh, this is the certification most strength coaches have. So I just got that when I was in college. You can do like an independent study. I did independent study, just read that real experience doing any strength training in terms of like coaching people in college. By the time I got to grad school and started doing that, I already had like the certification I needed, which was like a little bit unique. It was, I feel like I always had like the education more so than the experience early on. So then even when I left University of Utah, I had a ton of education because I had my master's, I had a bunch of certifications, but I'd only been like really coaching athletes for like 2 years. And then ever since then, obviously I've gained a lot of experience. But that's kind of how it started.
All right, and then looking at that, you said you had more education than experience, and like generally you hear like in the workforce per se, it's all about getting the experience and like what you learn in school. It's not really going to matter. It's all about what you pick up and with experience. Has that held true for you in the strength training world? Is like all the things I thought I know just based on education, they didn't all hold water once I started actually implementing it with athletes? What's kind of the balance of like education and then needing to actually get in the gym with players and athletes to like kind of figure it out yourself of what works?
Yeah, 100%. The experience is more important than the education. So the education definitely lays a good groundwork for your knowledge. And I think to be really good, you need both. But I would say I did it a little bit backwards. Not backwards, like I just had a lot of like degrees and certifications before I had like a ton of experience in the weight room. And I feel like you see that now with a lot of strength coaches. It's like some of them will get their masters and honestly some like even their PhDs before they even have much experience in the weight room. And I would rather personally, like if I was going to hire someone, I would rather have someone that had more experience, like actually coaching athletes in the weight room. And then like over time, they could get like their masters and get like other certifications and things like that. But I agree with what you're saying, Sam, in terms of nothing can replace experience. You can have all the knowledge in the world, but if you can't implement it and you can't get along with people, then none of it means anything. And I'm sure this is the only field I've ever worked in, but I'm sure it's the exact same thing in other jobs. Like you're reading the textbooks, you're taking the classes, and like it seems so black and white, so straightforward. You do this, 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 and this, and then you get a job, and the coach is like, "Well, I don't want to do any of those things." And you're like, "Oh shit, now what do I do?" Or you have like this happens a little bit less in college, and a little bit more in the pros. Like you have like a big time player. So even if you have the support of the coach, like you have a big time player making a couple $1 million a year, and you're just like, "No, I don't want to do any of that shit." And like, how do you navigate that? I probably shouldn't swear on this podcast, do any of that stuff. So the number one thing is dealing with people. And again, I'm sure it's the same with every field across the board. You just need to be good at dealing with people, get people to trust you, get people to like you, get people to want to be around you. And I think that's a big thing, especially in professional sports where it's optional. Where college it's a little easier because it's mandatory, right? It's like we have lifting today. Like you go to lifting, otherwise like you get suspended, you get benched, like you get whatever. There's consequences for not doing the prescribed things. Whereas in the professional environment, it's much different. Like every single one of our lifts is technically optional. Like if a guy is tired after training and doesn't want to come in and lift, then he doesn't come in and lift. And again, I can only speak from my experience with our teams. So our teams at RSL and the teams I've worked with in the past in New York, maybe some teams around the league have mandatory strength training, but for us, it's all optional. So a big part of it is being someone that the players want to be around. Because if they don't, even if they like strength training, if they don't like you and they don't want to be around you, the chance of them coming to the weight room is much lower, especially because a lot of these guys have money and they can just go do their own thing with like their own personal trainer on their own. So say they even are like really into strength training, but you're just not a people person and haven't done a good job establishing a relationship with them and they just don't want to work with you. It's like, okay, instead of going in the RSL weight room at 1:00 once practice is over, I'm just going to go eat lunch and then go home at 3:00. I'll work out with a personal trainer somewhere else, right? Because these guys have money, like they can do whatever they want. So I think the human interaction piece is huge.
No doubt. I think growing up is like, I can attest a lot of things from just having a trainer that I could bounce things off of and actually have that relationship. That's when you actually want to work and get better. So I guess in terms of like the learning curve you talked about, how did you sort of speed that up and ramp that up? And you talked about experience. So like initially when you were that intern or you're a graduate assistant, did you just base the workouts off the people you learn from, or did you like have your own nuance of how to like teach your guys?
So I think the best analogy that I've heard, I can't remember who I heard this from, is like you have cooks and you have chefs.
Yeah.
So like early on, like I was just a cook. Like I didn't know what I was doing, so I was following out someone else's recipe. So like a guy that was a strength coach that was really popular when I was coming up, and he still is. His name is Mike Boyle. So he has a bunch of books where he literally lays out like workouts in the book, like really basic workouts. Like, okay, we're going to do a push here. We're going to do a pull here. These are mobility exercises you should use. These are the single leg exercises you should use. These are the these are the like the hamstring exercises you should use, the quad exercises you should use, whatever. And it's kind of just like a plug and play model where it's like you have a whole list of exercises that he likes to use, and then like different places throughout the week you can plug in these exercises. So I would say early on I was very much a cook, like, cool, this is the Mike Boyle recipe, and I'm sure I took stuff from like Cody Locklane, who I worked with a lot at Utah, Charles Stevenson, who I worked with a lot at Utah, like learned from other strength coaches and just kind of took all their stuff and I was following their recipe. And I think that's a good way to do it early on. Like if you don't have a lot of experience coaching athletes, like, well, I might as well just follow someone who has a ton of experience coaching athletes. Then over time, the more experience you have, you become more of like that chef where it's like, instead of just following a recipe of workouts, it's like you're creating your own recipe. You're like, yeah, this is what's worked for me in the past, but now based on all this new experience I have, and like new research that's coming out and stuff, this is how I tweak this, this is how I tweak this, this is how I tweak this. Whereas if I look at the programs I work, like just looking at soccer, if I look at the programs I wrote for like Maryland soccer, whenever that was 5 years ago, versus the programs I write for the RSL guys now, they're not drastically different, but there's definitely like, you can see like things I've learned over the past 5 years that have changed it a little bit.
A lot of times you hear like, to create a great system, it's all about just subtracting out like the fluff and just subtracting out things that don't really work and just streamlining it to the basics. When you look at all the different, like you said, recipes that you tried, what are some things that stick out that you've definitely at least used to use as a chef or as a cook, whatever, and have cut out completely and kind of change your viewpoints on them after the experience?
It's hard. I mean, I would say a little bit controversially, I used to do a fair amount of core training, especially with you guys, with lacrosse guys, and I still think it does have a place, but I would say I do less than I used to now. And again, it's a little bit of product of the environment. We're like working with professional guys, you have like a pretty limited, with a lot of the guys, like attention span, where it's like they'll come in the weight room, maybe it's not their favorite thing in the world, but it's like you have like 30 to 45 minutes of like their attention span before they're like kind of over it, for lack of a better term. So you really need to just pare it down to the essentials. So I would say you get a lot. I've tried to really get rid of a lot of the fluff stuff, especially because a lot of guys will do their own things before training. It's like before training, they're going to be doing a lot of like the classic mini band stuff. So they're going to be doing a lot of core training exercises. They'll probably be doing just some buys and tries, such some beach body stuff like on their own. So anything I feel like they are going to do on their own or like have the capability to do on their own, those are the things that I'm cutting out and then just keeping it as essential as possible. We're like, not many guys are coming in and deadlifting on their own or doing like a rear foot elevated split squat on their own. So the things that I don't think they're going to do on their own, that's what we keep in. And then like a lot of like the core training stuff, like we'll still give them stuff to do, and it'll be like, okay, if you want to do this before practice, you can do this before practice. And the guys that are really into it will do it, and the guys that aren't. So yeah, kind of that via negativa approach, like streamlining what you do by just like getting the bare essentials and then getting the athletes really, really good at those essentials. And I think that model works well in soccer, especially professional soccer, because the guys don't have a lot of strength training experience for the most part, especially a lot of the foreign players. So really your biggest win is just getting them really good and really consistent at the basics. So if I have a guy who just getting him really good at doing reverse lunges, getting him really good at something so simple at like doing push-ups, getting him really good at doing pull-ups, just like incredibly basic strength training exercises. If you get them really good at the basics, like that's 90% of the battle right there. And then you can start layering in some of the more complex stuff. But the first things first, like you just want them to get really proficient and really strong at like the basic movements, and then you can kind of move on from there.
So what's the stigma around the core exercises? Because I remember I remember saying to you at Maryland, like, why don't we have any like core stuff at the end of the workout? And you were like, I remember you saying everything sort of incorporates your core, so you don't need to like specialize in just core. So what's the stuff around that?
Yeah. So again, I mean, definitely not every strength coach has my opinion. But kind of like you just alluded to, almost everything you do, if you're doing these exercises with good technique, they're going to require a lot of core stimulation and core engagement. So if you just are doing the rest of the basic strength exercises with good technique, you're likely getting a lot of core work in, especially when you're doing sprinting. I think sprinting is something that's underrated in terms of like core activation. So if you have guys doing a lot of good sprinting and things like that out on the field, that's also going to help. I'm not saying it definitely doesn't have its place, not especially in certain environments. So the way I approach it now is we'll typically do one anti-extension exercise where you're resisting extension. We'll do one anti-rotation exercise where you're resisting rotation. And then we usually do 2 or 3 exercises a week that involve what I call reverse flexion. And I think that's a term I may have made up or read somewhere, where it's like you're using your core to posteriorly rotate the hips. And that's great in soccer too, because that's usually going to involve some sort of hip flexor, which is a muscle group we're definitely trying to get with soccer players because it's commonly injured hip flexor muscle. So like a hanging knee raise would be something. A reverse crunch, I think we did a lot of it with you guys, would be something where you're using your core where it attaches at the anterior part of the pelvis to posteriorly rotate it, and then you're also getting a little hip flexor in there. So the idea is to give you a little more pelvic control than maybe you've had before. And I think that's especially important with lacrosse players who are constantly extending and rotating, tend to have a lot of tight backs and tend to be in that anterior pelvic tilt position. So giving the athletes the motor control and the strength to, on their own, hopefully subconsciously posterior tilt that pelvis to be in like a more neutral position is going to go a long way in terms of low back issues. I don't know if you remember that we did a lot of posterior pelvic tilting with you guys in terms of like hanging knee raises, reverse crunch, single leg reverse crunch, things like that.
You talked about the like groin injuries being a common problem in soccer, and I feel like it's pretty similar in lacrosse. Do you think it's really like, I know like we talked about before we started, like the sitting down idea and like stretching your flexors and stuff like that. Do you think it's more of like a strength problem or like a flexibility problem, or both?
For groin injuries?
Or just, yeah, like groin and hip flexor.
Yeah, so just from like a basic physics standpoint, the stronger a muscle is, the more resistant it is to injury because it can withhold and stand like a lot more tensile force, right? So strength is the number one thing. There's going to be some diminishing returns with strength, right? Like there's a point where you're so strong that doing more and more strength work isn't really going to help that much. You definitely want a certain level of strength, and it's going to be a little bit different with everyone kind of based on their injury history, based on their body size, things like that. But the number one thing is you want these muscles to be strong, especially the adductors. And then 2, it's just about like load management in terms of slowly ramping up like how much you're using them in training. So like, for example, lacrosse, it's a lot of change of direction, a lot of high intensity acceleration, decelerations, getting in and out of cuts. And those are things that are going to stress the groin a lot. So just managing that load. So you're coming in from an off season, it's like, okay, I mean, just throwing numbers out there hypothetically, I don't remember like lacrosse too much, but say in an average week, we're doing 150 high intensity XLs, decels, change of direction, like things that could be a little bit stressful on the groin. So if it's 150 in a normal week, so maybe we want to work up to that normal week. So the first week we're doing 75, the next week we're doing 115, the next week we're doing 150. So like the first 2 weeks are building up to a normal week. then maybe a deload week after that, we're back down to close around 100, and then like super or like overload it with like a 200 week, something like that. And before like another deload going into the first game or something, if you had like a 5-week preseason. So again, I know your guys' preseason is on the shorter side, so it's a little bit harder from in a team environment to mitigate those loads. So then I think the best advice for like a lacrosse player going into like a really short preseason is make sure your body is ready for what you're going to have to do in practice. So if you obviously lacrosse is a lot of XL, decel, change in direction, make sure you're doing that in your training leading up to your preseason camp, because you're not going to be able to use in your preseason camp to get in shape. It's so short, like you just get there and immediately rubber hitting the road going like 0 to 100. So you just want to make sure your body's as prepared as possible for that. So including a lot of high intensity XL, decels, change in direction in your training leading up to that camp, and then also just making sure those muscles are strong, doing classic like groin strengthening exercises like lateral lunges, Copenhagen's, things like that. Mobility does play a role. I would say not as big of a role as strength, but you want mobility up to a certain point, which essentially just means you want enough mobility to be able to do the movements that you need to do for your sport. So if you're constantly performing a movement that's like really close to your end range of motion, then that can potentially cause a problem. But if you have enough mobility to do whatever actions you typically do on the field, then you're fine. You don't necessarily need any more. And actually being like hypermobile can create an issue too, because it's like a continuum in terms of joint mobility, how much stability versus mobility you have. So again, there's some gray area and some room for nuance, but in general, the more mobile a joint is, the less stable it is. And then the more stable it is, the less mobile it is. So you want to be as mobile as possible, or you want to be as stable as possible and mobile enough, if that makes sense. You want to be mobile enough, but like going too much beyond that, it's actually going to open you up for injury because your stability is going to start to decrease as your mobility increases.
Right. And I think that's a huge thing to find as an athlete. I think injury prevention, number one, strengthening and mobility. I think there's those three sort of pillars that I sort of follow. Is there anything to gauge when you're doing too much mobility stuff versus stability stuff? Is there anything that you try to look for?
No, I wouldn't say there's like a cap on how much mobility work you can use. I would say if it's taking time away from other important things, like obviously I'm a strength coach, so I'm biased towards strength training, but I think strength training is the most important thing in terms of injury prevention. So one, strength training, and then probably 1B, or both. The two most important things is how strong you are, and then your load management strategy in terms of like what your body's prepared to do and not ramping it up too much in any given situation, which again, I know it's hard in your guys' situation because you have such a short preseason. So you need both. So say you're like one of the strongest guys, like incredibly strong, but you haven't done anything lacrosse movement wise. And then all of a sudden you have this 9-day preseason going into a first match. Like the chances of you getting hurt is extremely high because you're really strong, but you're still you're really strong in the weight room. You're exposing your muscle and like your entire body to like these movements and things that you weren't doing in the weight room, these hard change directions and like at these extremely high volumes that you can't mimic in the weight room. So making sure that, again, just your load management strategy going into these times of like super concentrated load with training and games is on point. But then on the flip side of the coin, say you're doing a lot and you've done a great job preparing your body on field for the movements that you're going to be doing in training. You're in really good shape. You've been playing a lot of lacrosse. You feel like you're ready for that concentrated loading period that's going to be like this tournament. But then your just baseline levels are really weak. You're still susceptible to injury because you just don't have that baseline strength in the muscle itself. So you definitely need both. So I would say those are the two most important things. And then I would say less important is your mobility levels. Again, it's just you want to be mobile enough, but as stable as possible. So mobile enough to do the things you need to do, and then like a ton of mobility beyond that in terms of like the joint range of motion that could actually be detrimental. And then in terms of how much mobility work you're actually doing, like I said before, it's just about if you're doing so much, it's taking away from other things, like taking away from how much you're sleeping, taking away from how much you're doing in the weight room, taking away from like how much maybe fitness work you're doing if that's the off season. And usually it doesn't fall in that category. So I don't feel like I've ever had a conversation with an athlete like, hey, you really need to scale back how much mobility work you're doing. Because it's like they're doing some stretching, some mobility exercises for maybe 15, 20 minutes a day. It's not something that's cutting into other things.
Right.
I usually don't see that as an issue. But the only time I see it as an issue is when people put such a high importance on it that they're doing so much mobility as opposed to strength training, as opposed to fitness work.
With that, you talked about, so with like muscles, the most important thing is probably the muscular strength itself to help prevent injury. What about for like ligament damage stuff? So like for me personally, I did 3 ACL tears. Do you think it's same thing, like the surrounding muscle strength, or do you think it's more mobility for stuff like that? Or what do you think can help with those different types of injuries where it's not just muscular?
Yeah, it's going to be a combination of both. Like, yes, I do think the supporting musculature around it, the stronger it is, the more stable it's going to keep the joint. Two, like we talked about the load management, where the more fatigued you get, the less motor control you have. So you could be really strong, but say you're out of shape, like out of lacrosse shape, you haven't been playing a lot, and all of a sudden you start playing a lot. As you get more and more tired, like neuromuscularly, you have less control. So you could be really strong, but like late in a game, you're going to have less control over your muscles and therefore less control of your joint positions just because you're so fatigued. So like being in a good spot in terms of your fitness and in terms of like how much load you feel like you can handle from a lacrosse perspective helps a lot as well. And then unfortunately, like some people are just more susceptible to it than others. Like some people just have lax joints and lax ligaments where you can do a lot of strength training. You can do a good amount of, I'm trying to think of what the word is. I hate keep using the word load management, but just making sure you're fit for the sport you're doing. It's not like you've done nothing and then all of a sudden you're playing lacrosse every single day. Like just being fit for your sport in terms of how much you've done on the field is maybe a better way to describe it. But even if you've done a really good job with both those things, like some people are just more susceptible to the others. But tendons and ligaments can get stronger with training, especially tendons, right? So the tendon response is delayed compared to the actual muscle response. So if you're doing a ton of strength training, the muscles are going to grow faster and get stronger faster than the tendons are going to get stronger. So that's one thing you want to be wary of too with athletes, is not doing too much so soon, because then you can start to develop like tendonitis issues and things like that, where they've gotten so much stronger muscularly in terms of their force production perspective, but their tendons haven't caught up to it. And I don't know off the top of my head what these specific timelines are, but yeah, the tendon strength, it's delayed. It takes longer to improve compared to the actual muscular strength. So just being aware of those things as well.
Yeah, I felt like that was a problem with me just getting right to school. Is like I came off 2 ACLs, and then I kind of just jumped right back into it. It was like, all right, like you'll do the first week non-contact, and then from there you'll just go full practice, like come back, do everything full. And it's like I thought it was fine, like thought it'd fit right in and everything, but like I felt like I just didn't do enough actual like lacrosse specific movements leading up. And like for me, example, I never had shin splints, but I just jumped back into it, and all of a sudden I had like the worst shin splints ever, and it just like it kind of snowballed for sure.
Yeah, that's actually a really good indicator that you've done too much is shin splints, right? Shin splints is like the most classic overuse injury there is.
Yeah.
So if you're getting really severe shin splints, and that's a pretty good indicator that the rest of your body isn't ready for what you're asking it to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, looking back, I definitely feel like I wasn't ready. I remember the biggest thing, they were like, all right, just start tying your shoes more and they should go away. I was like, all right, we'll see. We'll see about that. But you mentioned like a big thing with guys coming in who didn't have a lot of experience with weightlifting and just making sure they're getting the right movements. And that's like 90% of the battle. And then I was doing a little bit of digging on your Twitter, and like I saw you retweet something from a year ago saying that if you could have 14 to 16-year-old kids just lift consistently and sleep 9 hours a day, that would be equivalent to them like taking PEDs. So for a young athlete that maybe isn't as serious into weightlifting and stuff like that, or you could just have a child and just ideally just be like, all right, like this child's going to start doing body weight weightlifting at age 9. Now he's going to do this. He's going to be sleeping 9 hours a week. what would be your ideal kind of regimen for a kid to get into weightlifting and maximize their body and their potential long term right from the start?
Yeah. So again, just going back to the basics, like so many people are looking for like the second order effects or like the next level of what they can do to separate themselves physically, but they're not doing any of the basics even right. So that tweet, I'm just kind of touches on that in terms of you want to be sleeping at least 8 hours a night, because it's going to help so much in terms of recovery, hormone production, all those things. You want to be drinking adequate amounts of water. You want to be eating enough protein and enough calories in general. So again, it's like super, super basic stuff. And then in terms of, so if you're getting the basics right, that's going to go a long way. And then the strength training piece, I don't think there's any age where it's better or worse to start actually strength training. Like, yes, doing bodyweight exercises and like mastering bodyweight movements is good. I don't think there's anything magical necessarily about it, but yeah, I mean, you don't need to be bench pressing if you can't do 10 push-ups is a good way to put it. You don't need to be doing like these heavy pulls and like lat pull downs if you can't do 10 bodyweight pull-ups. So I would say there is some value to mastering the bodyweight things early on. So the push-ups, pull-ups, bodyweight squat, bodyweight lunges, things like that. And you can get pretty far upper body wise, I would say, just doing bodyweight things, but lower body wise, in terms of actually increasing strength production capabilities, you're going to run out pretty quickly just doing bodyweight stuff. In terms of like actually in the weight room, like, yes, you can do bodyweight squats, you can do bodyweight reverse lunges, things like that. But at some point you need to start adding external load. But also kind of on the flip side of that is you want to, it's not just all about like the external load or like the intensity of the exercise. It's a lot about the velocity of the movement as well. So you can also go a long way with just doing a lot of bodyweight jumping, single leg and double leg, doing a lot of different plyometrics, and then sprinting and doing acceleration activities. So you hear people talk about in the weight room of like doing velocity-based training and always trying to move the bar as fast as possible. And it's like, okay, you might be undulating between heavy days and really light days. And the light days we're using really low loads, trying to move the weight as quickly as you can to get more explosive. But nothing in the weight room moves at 10 meters per second. And that's how fast you're moving when you're sprinting. I mean, a kid, it's not going to be quite that fast. But sprinting is going to be the most intense thing you can possibly do from a velocity perspective. And then jumping, I would say, is right next in line behind that. So I would say, especially early on for kids, getting comfortable sprinting with good technique and getting comfortable accelerating and decelerating with good technique is also very, very important to kind of answer your question. Where, yeah, like the body weight movements in the weight room are going to play a small role. But I would much rather have an athlete that has zero weight room experience, but they can sprint with good technique and they can accelerate and decelerate with good technique. Because that's what you're actually doing out on the field. So mastering those body weight movements as opposed to body weight movements in the sense of like squatting, lunging, the body weight movements of acceleration, deceleration, change of direction, those things, having good mechanics in those things are going to go such a long way in terms of performance and injury reduction. Because really from an injury reduction standpoint, when you're sprinting or when you're changing direction at full speed, the amount of forces that's going through your muscles and tendons is so high that all the strength training in the world isn't going to necessarily protect you from an injury if you have such bad mechanics where those forces are being displaced into areas they shouldn't be. Whereas good mechanics are going to have those forces moved into like joint angles that your body can absorb, and that's going to be much more beneficial than just being super strong. So kind of going back to your injury before, if I remember, you were pretty strong in the weight room, and obviously like there's so many other factors, and your injuries, I think a lot of them happened before you even got to college, right?
Yeah, I did one my junior year of high school and then one my senior year of high school, and they're all non-contact.
Yeah. So I'm not saying this is what you could have done different or this is the reason, like just hearing and speculating, again, there could be a million factors. But you, again, I remember you being pretty strong in the weight room, but it doesn't matter how strong you are if you're decelerating and changing direction with really poor mechanics. Just the forces are so high, it doesn't matter how strong you are. Your body's not going to be able to handle those.
Yeah, I feel like a big thing for me too is like my junior year, I tore it like right after football season. missed the entire lacrosse season. And then same thing senior year, came back for football, played the entire football season, tore it in the last game of the football season, missed the entire lacrosse season. So it was like 2 straight years of not really, I mean, obviously I was doing stuff on my own, but not getting that like full speed, like full game, like experience of like those lacrosse specific movements. And I literally remember like one of my like first, it was like I was at Maryland for a week, and then it was like first day non-contact. And I remember just going into like a one-on-one line and just being like, I haven't done a one-on-one with someone in like 3 years. And I'm up here going against like the best players in the country. And just like I said, I mean, obviously it happened so fast then I didn't really understand what was going on. But just looking back, it's like, I feel like there's so much more that I could have done just in terms of like preparing and just like making sure I was focusing on like doing those really hard lacrosse movements all the time. And obviously it's like a fine line of like balancing of like protecting your knee and like not doing as much like full speed movements and stuff. But just coming back, I feel like definitely needed like that whole just specific movement stuff was somewhere that I lacked.
Yeah, I mean, exactly how you said it. You definitely want to protect the injury at some point, but then if you know you're going to be going into full speed one-on-one, like you said, against some of the best players in the country, you don't want the first time you're doing that to be in that instance. You want to have done that for a couple weeks leading up to that.
Yeah.
No, and it's tough. I mean, college sports is tough. Like especially like a sport like lacrosse that maybe isn't as well funded or as popular as like college football. It's like someone like you arrive on campus, you probably have a lot of unique needs that the rest of the team doesn't have. But how many guys are on the lacrosse team? 50? Something like that? 50, yeah. So I'm just thinking about it from like a support staff perspective. Like I would be the one strength coach, and then you would have one athletic trainer, right? 2 of us. And really for us, we're mostly worried about the team as a whole and less concerned, right or wrong, with like one person coming in that has like an injury, right? So it's so tough. I'm not saying like in hindsight like that at college, like athletic trainers and strength coaches like can't always strive to do a better job, but it's just such a tough environment where like you would need like so much specific work to avoid the situation like you just said that you were in. But so say it's your freshman year, like you come in, I have no idea about these previous injuries for the most part. And then hopefully our athletic trainer knows and we can get on the same page. But I'm just thinking back to like the college environment, and nothing's ever going to be perfect, right? It's not as well funded. You don't have as much staff. And it's just, I'm just trying to think back to your situation. That's how those situations arise.
Yeah. And especially when you're coming in from high school, it's like, you're even more on your own kind of in high school, where it's like you're seeing a trainer, you're seeing a physical therapist, and then they give you 2 weeks of workouts that you do on your own. And just like, there's so much uncertainty from like a trainer's perspective coming in with like a kid coming from high school just into the freshman year. Like it's hard to know exactly what's going on for sure.
Yeah. Working on, sorry to cut you off, Connor, but just thinking like working on the Olympic sports side, like compared to like college football, we'll have like 5 strength and conditioning coaches and multiple athletic trainers and like a physical therapist to just work with football. Whereas like me, and I'm trying to remember I think it was Amelia was the athletic trainer then. So like I was working with you guys, I was working with gymnastics, I was working with soccer. So like you just have so much going on that it's really hard to give athletes like you the individual attention that you necessarily need.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, with that, in terms of dealing with a team, how do you sort of, because I think every athlete's different in terms of whether it's pushing weight, whether it's out and change direction. How do you sort of build like the individuality between each guy of dealing with that team? Do you have certain programs that you could jump from, or how do you do it?
So a lot of it is just kind of in my environment now is just feeling it out with the guys. It's going to be drastically different working with a guy who has 0 strength training experience, coming from say like Columbia, where he's like they've never been exposed to strength training ever, and they might have some like poor preconceived notions about it. So one, you just need to make sure you're getting him to do things that he likes to do and he perceives as beneficial. So that's actually one thing I feel like I didn't even realize this coming into the soccer world. Is not only are like some like people in like kind of like soccer cultures like not interested in strength training, some like think it's detrimental. Like, oh, like I'm going to ruin my body. I'm going to ruin my muscles, like going into the weight room. So it's a battle just to kind of dispel that notion.
Right.
So like when you have guys like, and another thing is that a lot of people don't is the language thing. We have 4 guys on our team that don't speak English. So just getting through, like, it's really hard to give them like a little bit more of a like advanced or complicated program when you guys literally aren't speaking the same language. Um, so I would say so say you have like a South American, and it's not just South American, you would have like a lot of times Italian, Spanish, French players that have no strength training experience and maybe have like don't think it's beneficial. So one, it's going to start with like a conversation, like getting them in there and getting them to like feel comfortable with you. And then 2, like giving them exercises that don't look like traditional strength training, if that makes sense. It sounds bad, but almost like tricking them into doing like strength training movements where they don't think it's strength training. So like if you are going to have them do like a deadlift or like a back squat or like a bench press, like maybe those would be 3 movements that you would want them to do. But because it involves like big weights and a barbell, like they're automatically out on that because like, no, that looks like something an American football player would do. Like no shot. So like we have what's called a K box, which is like flywheel training. So we do a lot of stuff with our guys on that. We have like another like flywheel resistance thing called the Versa pulley. So we do a lot of strength training on those things with our guys who maybe don't love traditional movements. So with those guys, it's one, keeping the program super basic, and then slowly over time, like kind of titrating in and just doing a little bit more of like the normal strength training stuff, like as they get to trust you more. So it might start out as like, okay, we're almost doing things exclusively on the K box because that's the one piece of equipment that they think that they'll use. And then over time, it's like, okay, we're doing half our stuff on the K box and then like half our stuff like with like some dumbbells and barbells as the guys start to trust you a little bit more and getting them to do more basic strength training movement if that's what's appropriate for them. So you kind of have that. You have like the young academy like type players that are like 17 or 18 who need a lot in the weight room because they might have a lot of technical skill, but they're so inferior physically to the rest of the players just on the basis that they're little kids playing against grown men. So they're a program, they're usually going to be doing a little bit more in the weight room, which is easier to do because they're getting less time in matches. So like maybe the day before a match, like you just know they're not going to play. So you can do like a full, like another lower body strength training session with them that you're not going to do with the rest of the group. And then even throughout the week, just because they're young and they can handle a little more and they're going to be involved less in practice. Like if we're playing 11v11, there's some guys that are just going to, like the starters are going to play the whole time no matter what. Whereas like some of the young guys, the reserves, they're going to be rotated in or out. So they're just going to be doing less at practice some days compared to other days. So you can push them a little bit more in the weight room on those days too. So having a little bit more volume. So that's kind of another group that we have, like a little bit higher volume group that actually need to put on more size and gain strength pretty quickly to be able to compete. And then we have some guys actually you don't want to get any bigger. Where it's like they already have really good size for soccer and they already have pretty good strength. We have like 2 or 3 of these guys. So it's like we want to maintain their strength levels as much as possible, but we want to minimize like gaining any more size, like even in their legs, just because, again, that's just extra mass. If they're already strong enough to do what they need to do, you don't want to be adding all this extra mass that they have to carry around for 90 minutes. It just serves no purpose. Like if they're already pretty fast, they're already pretty injury resistant, they're already pretty explosive, and say they're getting on a little bit, like they're a little bit older, like late 20s, early 30s, it's like you're just almost doing maintenance work in season where you're still strength training. You might be able to get a little bit stronger, but it's just much less volume than what like the younger guys are doing, and a lot lower impact stuff. Just as guys get older, they're just not able to handle as much. So maybe we'll do plyos, like body weight plyos on the field with everybody, but some of the older guys, we won't do any weighted plyos in the weight room. It's like a dumbbell jump squat or like a barbell jump squat, things like that. Those might be things that we're doing like 2 times a week with the younger guys who really need to get stronger, more explosive. But the older guys, we're not doing any of those because it's just extra added impact that you kind of do like a cost benefit analysis. Like, yeah, it might be able to help them a little bit, but like, is it worth like the extra pounding on their joints that we're going to get when this guy's 29, 30, and we're just trying to get him to play every single match. So you definitely have like different groups of players, and I'd be lying to tell you if like you walk into a new situation, you know which kind of group everyone falls into right away. You just kind of how we've done it is like we have like a team program that I would say probably 40 to 50% of the team is on, where they're just doing like 50% of the team is doing almost exactly the same thing. There might be like slight variations in terms of volume. There might be slight variation in terms of exercise selection. Like this guy likes the back squat. This guy likes the deadlift. This guy likes to use the pit shark as like their main lower body movement. And we'll make those adjustments. And then the rest of the group, like the other 50% are pretty unique programs based on their injury history, based on their age, based on how many minutes they're getting, things like that. So again, it's really hard to do in college when you have so many guys. And in the professional environment, I'm only worried about 26 guys, right? So I can focus all my attention on 26 guys. But then within those 26 guys, the diversity compared to college is huge. You have 17-year-olds. We have a player that's 38. You have goalkeepers, which are drastically different than field players. You have guys that are already really big and strong versus guys that are really super weak. You have guys who speak English versus guys who don't speak English. You have a lot of different things you need to balance. So yeah, you kind of just, again, what we would do is kind of start guys, everyone kind of on the same program. And then over the course of weeks, it really evolves when you start to understand what they like, what they don't like, what's going to be beneficial for them, what's not going to be beneficial for them, kind of like how their bodies feel week in, week out, things like that.
Right. So for me, I think the toughest thing, I think growing up, honestly, like middle school, high school, college, now I've sort of got a lot of like, I'm educated on the fact of like when to go on the field and do some work, when to go in the weight room, making that balance of like, hey, I think I've had that question each day, like, what should I do? Should I go in the weight room? What's going to be more important for me? And I guess for the question in terms of, to help you better answer it, in terms of building a foundation, if you were to limit your week's work into like 10%, you could only do 10% of what you'd optimally do during the week. What would you focus on to build a great foundation, to be, I guess, a lacrosse player for this question?
So I think it matters drastically on age. So young players, and I feel like I've had this talk when I was at Maryland. I did some stuff with some high school players. Like your skill is your ticket to the big time, right? Like it doesn't matter how strong you are in the weight room, how injury resistant you are. Like you just have to be good at lacrosse. So I would say it's a spectrum that skews more towards strength training and like physical work later in your career. Whereas because when you're young and your brain is so plastic and you can improve like biomotor ability so quickly, like the skill acquisition is so much quicker when you're younger. So you really want to be focused on skill early on. And then as you get later in your career, so like late 20s, early 30s, things like that, like your skills are your skills. You don't get much better. Like, how old are you, Connor? 25. So, I mean, at this point, you're probably not going to get that much better at lacrosse now. Like the way you play now, you're not going to suddenly like, I don't know if like you're a good left-handed shooter, but like that's not something you're going to develop now. Like if you're not a good left-handed shooter by the time you're 25, you're probably never going to be a good left-handed shooter. You might be able to get better a little bit, but like the skill is pretty cemented at that point. So then I would say the easiest way to improve is become a little bit better physically now as you get a little bit older. I mean, obviously you can't ignore the skill component. Like you want to continue to stay sharp on those things, but like the amount of improvement that you can get in terms of skill is the window's narrowing the older and older you get. So then you can start to see improvement though, like with what you're doing in the weight room, what you're doing fitness wise, things like that. Those are going to be things that I think that you can improve your game or maintain your game at a high level if you're improving physically, if that makes sense. Like the best way I have heard it like talked about is our old academy coach was saying like essentially by the time you leave your academy, he was trying to like we had like a bad practice and he was trying to talk to like our U19 players about like the urgency of having good training sessions every single day. And he was like, the way he put it, he's like, you are the player you are by the time you leave the academy. So I think it was a little extreme, but he was essentially saying by the time you're 19 years old, like you're the player you're going to be. You only get better at terms of being more consistent with the skills you have and quicker with the skills you have. So again, to bring it back to you, like you can, again, you're probably not going to develop like an awesome left-handed shot if you don't already have this by the time you're 25. But whatever skills you do have, you can become more consistent with them. So you can become like, okay, I can, again, I don't know lacrosse skills as well. So like if you can like pick corners from the outside, like you can get more consistent at that. Whereas before you were hitting them 5 out of 10 times, but now you can hit them 6 out of 10, 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10. So you can get more consistent with the skills you have, and you can get quicker with the skills you have. So like doing those same things under pressure quicker, but you're not going to develop a whole new skill set essentially once you're into your 20s. So that's a super long explanation to say, I would say early on, you really want to focus on skill, because by the time you're like in your 20s, the window's pretty closed in terms of developing new skills. And then that's when I would start to focus a little bit more on the physical side of things. Not that you ignore it completely early on, but you really want to take advantage of the physical or of the skill side of things when you're young. Like a really good analogy is like language, right? Like you see kids pick up new languages like that. Like it's insane. Whereas if I was going to learn a new language now at 31, it would take me months and months. Whereas like little kids can pick up new languages. Yeah. Just as you get older, picking up new skills becomes astronomically harder. So that, but getting better physically, it still becomes harder as you get older, but not quite to the same effect.
Yeah, I heard someone talking about that, and the idea with like kids being able to just pick up their skills so much faster, just like the fact that they don't have as much like going on in their brain. Like if they want to be Kobe Bryant, they can literally just sleep on just having basketball in their head all the time, and like you don't have that luxury when you get older to just like focus all your mental time on your craft and your skill. But say for lacrosse, a lot of people say you don't play professionally in lacrosse, and your career is just your high school career and then your college career. So your career is ending at, say, age 22. And obviously, so based on what you said, most of your time you want to focus on skill. But if you do put some time into the physical side of things, of training and like weightlifting, if you could cut, say a kid's doing 20 hours of skill training a week, 10 hours of physical training a week, and you had to cut that down to an hour, like just 10%, 1 hour of just the physical training, what would you tell them to focus on? Like do like 40 minutes of sprint work and 20 minutes of squatting? Like what would be the most crucial 10% of that physical work?
Yeah, I would say the sprinting is number one. Like if you could include anything in an athlete's like physical development plan, it's going to be sprinting. And then behind that, I would say if you want to start splitting hairs, accelerating is different than sprinting. So I would say actually 1, accelerating, 2, top end speed works like sprinting, and then 3 is going to be like plyometrics. So like really all body weight stuff that are done at really high velocities. So I'd say those are the 3 things. And then I would say the weight room stuff is secondary to that. Like even as you get older, like if you had to choose between acceleration stuff, body weight plyos, and sprinting stuff, I would choose those 3 things all day over like weight room activities. Now that the weight room activities are important and different, but I think maintaining your ability to sprint, to accelerate, and to change direction is more valuable than anything you're going to do in the weight room.
And then similarly, another Twitter find I saw you had, it was a retweet, and he basically said fitness is about being able to play faster and be able to play faster for longer. So obviously it's similar to what you're saying with just like being able to play faster, working on that sprinting stuff. But when it comes to playing faster longer, like I saw you had some stuff on there as well, just kind of about like you don't want to like limit how much you train, but obviously there's like a balance of like not overtraining. So when it comes to playing faster and playing faster for longer, as opposed to just going out and running 10 miles and be like, all right, I'm working on my endurance, how do you build on that?
Yeah, I mean, so there's different models for how you do things. I mean, there definitely is a place for fitness work, playing the sport itself, which is obviously the most important. And then like just straight physiological fitness work, kind of what you alluded to, like just going out and doing fitness, like running 10 miles, doing fitness for fitness sake. And I think both have their place. And I think especially in the off season, you're probably going to do a little bit more towards the straight physiological fitness thing. Because 1, you're not with your team, so you can't do that. And 2, it's giving your body a break from those like lacrosse or soccer, whatever sport you're playing, those sport specific movements, and then focusing on something else, I think that's going to go a long way in terms of longevity and like avoiding burnout and things like that. But if you had to pick between the two, you're going to want to do the sport specific stuff. Like I'm sure you guys have experienced this. Like, so I give you when I was your strength coach at Maryland, if I give you an off-season conditioning program, say you follow it to a T, but you're not playing any lacrosse. Once you come back in the fall and you're playing, and you're actually training and playing lacrosse, you don't feel like you're in great shape. So you have like a good baseline, and your ceiling is now really high for how lacrosse specific shape you can be in. But you still don't have that lacrosse specific shape without actually playing lacrosse. So that's the one way I like to look at it, is like the straight fitness off the field is going to raise the ceiling for how high you can get your lacrosse specific fitness, but it definitely can't replace it. The lacrosse specific, like playing lacrosse is the only way you can get in lacrosse shape. So I know in soccer, I don't know as much about what's popular in lacrosse right now. But in soccer, it's fairly popular to not do any fitness without the ball at all. Like the only fitness you do is in training itself. So probably what I was alluding to in that tweet is this guy, Raymond Verhagen, who's pretty controversial, but like a well-known fitness coach in the soccer world. Their main fitness would be, how he would define it is like playing the style that you want to play for 90 minutes. Like that's how you're fit. Like there's no fitness test. There's no anything like that. If we can play the way we want to play for 90 minutes, that's how we're fit. So how we get there is maybe the first day we're playing 10 minutes of 11v11. Again, just to really simplify it, say we're playing 10 minutes of 11v11, and by like the 9th minute, like it starts to slow down. Like the last minute guys aren't playing the way they want to play. Like, okay. So then the next week we might do like 2 by 6 minutes. So we're increasing the total volume, and it's like, okay, for those 2 6-minute blocks, we were able to maintain the level we wanted to play. And then the next time we do it, we're going to play 2 by 8 minutes, and building up until you can play the way you want to play for 90 minutes. So in like that model, they'd be doing no extra fitness work. The only quote unquote fitness work they're doing is playing the game themselves and then slowly extending out the time for how long they're playing that game. So the intensity is always 100%. There's no like, oh, we're playing at 80% or anything like that. The intensity is always 100%, and then just slowly building out how long you can maintain that 100% for. And I think it's it would be a little bit easier in lacrosse just because the volumes of distance you guys cover and how quickly you can sub in and out. Like you still need fitness levels in lacrosse, and being more fit is definitely better than being less fit, obviously. But in soccer, most players, the majority of the players will play the entire 90 minutes with no subs. So fitness is like extremely important in soccer, because once you step on the field, like you don't come off, you just play the entire time. So, and the game is much longer and you're covering much more distance. So the fitness piece is a little bit more important in soccer than it would be in lacrosse.
And then similarly with that, you mentioned sport specific movements. So one trend that's kind of been coming up with a lot of the guys and girls we've been interviewing is we'll ask them, what are bad recommendations you hear in your area of expertise, so in the lacrosse world most generally? And a lot of things that they've been saying is basically not to specify in one sport, and that they get a lot of benefit from, if they played football, they got a ton of benefit for playing lacrosse. If they played soccer or basketball, it benefited them lacrosse. But one thing I saw, again, digging through your Twitter, I saw you say something just basically kind of taking the other side of that argument, saying that you don't really see the benefit of playing multiple sports and think it's more beneficial to kind of just focus on one specific sport to be the best of that sport. So if you want to just kind of just talk about your opinion on that.
Yeah, so I think it matters on where your sport falls in the spectrum of physicality versus like pure skill. So I would say like on the pure skill side of the spectrum, you have like golf, tennis. I would say golf's even more extreme. Like golf, it's all technique and skill, right? Athleticism is always going to help a little bit, fitness and athleticism. But like if you're not good at hitting the ball, like that's the only thing that matters in golf. Whereas on the complete opposite side, you might have like rugby or American football, where it's all about physicality, right? Like a skill position in football is the running back, right? A running back's considered a skill position. You hand off and you run where there's open space. Like really, to me, like the only skill position in football is like the quarterback. where you're actually having to like read the defense and like make throws and stuff. So I think if your sport falls a little bit more towards the physical side of where like physicality is more important, again, like football, rugby, things like that, you can be world class at your sport while simultaneously playing other sports. Like there are plenty of stories of like just these unbelievable athletes who had never played football until like their junior year of high school. And then they're just so physically dominant that like they get a D1 scholarship and all of a sudden in the NFL, and they're in the NFL. They've only been playing football for 5 years.
Pat Mahomes.
What?
Pat Mahomes, quarterback, started his junior year of high school.
Yeah. And that's even more surprising because I feel like that's on the skill side of things for football. But if you're 6'4", 350 pounds and like pretty fast, like that's not something you have to work on. You just are that thing. And then that is what's really important to be like a DN in football, for example. So you can get away with like starting the sport late because it's less actual skill. It's more just physicality. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, golf, tennis, and I would say soccer is more towards that side. The skill component is so far outweighs the physical component that if you don't develop those skills early on, you have 0% chance of being world class. So yes, you might increase the chance of burnout. Yes, you might increase the chance of injury. Yes, you might increase, like there's all these negative things that come along with becoming sport specific at a really young age. But I think that's just like the cost of doing business. That's the collateral damage of being world class in a skill sport, right? Like when you hear about like there's tennis academies that people go to and live there starting out when they're like 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. Soccer has the same thing. Like the academy, like in Europe, like Europe can be like in a high level academy, 7, 8, 9 years old, where like you live away from your parents and like you train all the time. Exact same thing in golf. Like these guys are playing golf nonstop from when like they're like before they're even teenagers. And those are the only guys that make it the highest level. Like, and there's a big difference between world class and just professional. Like you can be like a professional MLS soccer player and have started maybe focusing on soccer a little bit later, maybe even played multiple sports like all through high school and things like that. But there's a difference between just being a professional and being world class. Like if you're going to be world class, like a national team player, like a player that's going to go to a World Cup or something like that, I think you'd be really, again, just talking about soccer, really, really hard pressed to find a player that people would consider a world-class player that wasn't only playing soccer by the time they were 12 years old. And I would say the same thing for tennis. I think if you looked at the, like say the ATP rankings, the top 100 players, I have no idea if this is true, but I would be shocked if there's anyone that's one of the top 100 tennis players in the world that wasn't only playing tennis by the time they were 12 years old. Same thing with golf. Anyone ranked in the top 100, I bet they were all only playing golf by the time they were 12. And then you don't see that in other sports that are more physical.
Makes sense.
Which is like a give and take, right? Like from like a pure physical health and mental health standpoint, I think specializing in these sports super early, 100% not the greatest thing. But there is, like I said, there's a cost of doing business to being world-class at anything.
Yeah.
Like being a world-class athlete isn't mentally super healthy. Being a world-class athlete physically isn't super healthy. So again, if you're just trying to form like a well-rounded person that's like mentally well-balanced and like physically like pretty robust, they have like a lot of different movement variability, they've like played multiple sports growing up, like great. But like if you want to be a World Cup winning soccer player, that balanced life probably isn't in the cards for you. Yeah. And I would say lacrosse is kind of right in the middle. Like lacrosse, you need to be quick, fast, strong, athletic. Like all those things help a lot, but you also have a lot of skill. Like, I think I remember, and I really hope I'm not selling him short because obviously he's one of the best players in the world, right? Like Matt Rambo, you would never like, he's not the best athlete of all time. I don't think that's a stretch saying that, but his skill is so high, like he's fine. And then you have someone like Colin Heacock would be like almost on the other side. He also has a ton of skill, don't get me wrong, but I would say his biggest attribute is his athleticism. So I would say lacrosse is a little bit of give and take.
One thing you mentioned there with the give and take that we've heard as well is just the specialization leading to injury. Where is that just from doing the same movements all the time that you're just more susceptible to injury, or where does that come from?
Yeah, that's kind of the main thing is if you're just doing the same thing over and over and over, especially if you're doing it from pre-puberty, like, yeah, just there's just like a certain amount of bandwidth, like a certain amount of time, like a joint can like take like the exact same stresses over and over and over. And then so the injury rate is a lot higher if you're doing the same thing all the time year round from a really young age.
That's a very good point. That's very good in terms of the skill. I guess jumping now to nutrition and stuff like that. I remember you talked about like